Welcome to day 68. We have Deuteronomy chapters 10 to 12 and Mark 16, which will be the final chapter of the book of Mark. We hear the story of Moses making two new tablets and a wooden chest to hold them, and going back to talk to God after the original stone tablets were broken at the golden calf incident. When we get to verse 12 and 13, we have a phrase here that we think of more with Micah 6:8. But what does God expect of God's people? And it's not quite as pithy as Micah 6:8 here, but it's very much in the same set of expectations. Live in God's presence, follow God's path, love God, and obey God's instructions, which it does not explicitly say this, but God's instructions include care for neighbors and strangers. So this very much is in line with Micah 6:8, and it's in line with the great commandment that Jesus gives in Matthew. In verses 14 to 18, we are again reminded that everything around us is God's, it is not ours. And then we get to a really tough thing that is something that we are struggling with in the world right now. God doesn't play favorites. God cares for widows and orphans. God cares for foreigners with food and clothing. And in verses 19 to 21, it talks about how God expects us to treat foreigners with the same loving care, reminding them that they had been foreigners in Egypt and had accepted loving care when they were fleeing famine and moved to Egypt in the first place. This is a really tough topic for us today. The issue of borders around the world is a huge thing. Citizenship is a huge thing. It's a big deal here in the United States, but it's a big issue in a lot of places around the world. Now, some Christians right now are trying to explain why this teaching of caring for foreigners with food and clothing does not apply to us today in the United States. One claim that I've heard is that the biblical references to caring for foreigners and strangers only applies to legal foreigners who follow the law and are under the jurisdiction of the Israelite people. When I read this, and when I read the other sections of both the Old Testament and New Testament that talk about showing hospitality, care, food, clothing, shelter to foreigners and strangers, I don't see this type of distinction in the biblical text. Now, borders and citizenship didn't really exist in the same way back then. Many of our concepts of borders and citizenships are really only 100 years old. A bunch of stuff here in the US didn't start until the 1920s, long after many, if not most of our families, those of you who are watching that are from my congregation, had already immigrated to the United States. But people in need are the same, regardless of what time period we're talking about, regardless of what legal governmental structure we are talking about. There are people in need who are facing the same problems in biblical times and today, people fleeing poverty, starvation, and violence. No matter what people are fleeing from, I believe when we read the text, God is calling us to meet their needs, no matter what the cause of their needs is. Now, one of the things that I wrestle with is, are we believing as a nation that we have so little that we can't share, that any sharing would somehow disrupt our lives or undermine our resources? Are we thinking that God's not going to bless us with enough resources to care for others? I think as we read through Deuteronomy here in Moses' sermon, Moses is constantly reminding people that God provides and God will care for us when we are obedient. Um, I know I don't try to often put exact details into these of today's issues into these reflections, but I am just really struck in the news that I'm reading today. Right now, we have deportations building up, and we've got some people trying to cut off the U.S. Aid Department, that is one of the biggest providers of humanitarian food assistance in the world. And I find this ironic and painful because it's one thing to have a policy that says we're going to limit who can come into the US and live within the US. but then to also cut off the food aid that allows people to stay in their home countries, in their home communities, without making the dangerous journey to another country for shelter and food. That seems to be at counter purposes. If we would like people to stay at home, perhaps we can share some of our resources so that we can build up their countries, their economies, so that they want to stay at home. Most of them do want to stay at home. They don't really want to have to move here and learn a whole new culture and language and everything else that they have to disrupt in their lives in order to come here. So what if we do more to help people where they're at? And would that take some of the pressure off the migration issues that we feel here in the United States? I think we have to be really careful when we're thinking about some of the policy choices that are facing us. Sometimes I think we are at cross purposes and we say one thing is the priority we have, but then we take other actions that undermine that. And I think the real question when we look at this tough topic of immigration and care for low income people and people who are struggling, I think we have to really face the fact that frequently it is fear and anxiety that is driving our decisions. And I think that is something that we have to take to God in prayer, and we have to open ourselves that God might have another way for us to deal with our fear and anxiety instead of turning against people who are in need. At the end of the day, I don't know what the policy answers are, but I do worry that God is watching us. God has told us what God expects, and what God expects is compassion and mercy, hospitality, and sharing. In chapter 11, verses 18 to 21, we again are reminded to teach our kids and to put God's word on our hearts. When we turn to Mark 16, we have an interesting finale to Mark's gospel. The women are coming to care for Jesus' body. Now, the reason they're doing this on Sunday morning is that by the time Jesus died, the Sabbath begins at sundown on Friday night in the Jewish tradition. So there was just barely enough time to get Jesus off the cross and get him into a tomb and then get home for the Sabbath. That meant there was no time to prepare Jesus' body to cleanse it respectfully the way that was usually done. Now, Sabbath would end at sundown on Saturday, but that means then it's dark. And so women could not then go and care for Jesus' body at that time. So that's why they were at the tomb at sunrise on Sunday morning. It's the first time that they had enough light to do what they wanted to do. Now we get to the tricky part of Mark. Verses 9 through 20, which sound an awful lot like the endings of Matthew and Luke, do not exist in the earliest copies of the book of Mark that we have. And verse 8 has always been seen as the traditional ending of Mark, and it is a confusing ending. Jesus said before his death that there would be more to the story, and yet Mark just ends it. And Mark ends with the women being afraid and not telling people what the angelic messenger told them to tell. Now, the women's fear continues a narrative from the entire story of Mark of fear and not among the disciples, the followers of Jesus, and not doing what Jesus asked them to do. And that fear is often a sign of a lack of faith. Now, I don't want to be too hard on the women here because obviously we all know the ending of the story. So they obviously told someone at some point. The addition is trying to fill in these gaps because it feels really awkward and abrupt to end at verse 8. And since the second century, when the addition was added, people have been uncomfortable with just ending Mark where we ended it. But I wondered, as I read this today and wrestle with this myself today, if we need to live with the discomfort of not knowing everything. I am wondering today if Jesus didn't teach by giving, or I am remembering today that throughout his ministry, Jesus did not teach by giving all the answers. Jesus often had disruptive stories that didn't seem to have enough details in it for us to understand everything going on. And I'm wondering if, with an abrupt ending, Mark is continuing in the tradition of Jesus' teaching and wants us to discover and think and take responsibility for continuing kingdom work when we don't know all the answers, when we don't have all the details, when we don't know how it's going to end. So I think this is the real question we have to wrestle with today. What do we do when we find the empty tomb and Jesus is gone and that's all we know? I'll let you sit with that for today and we'll see you next time. Bye.